Okay, good morning. My name is Ruth Nordstrom. I'm the studio manager at Soho. Today I'd like to talk about concept to construction, essentially aimed at homeowners and empowering them to have the knowledge to move forth with choosing to build sustainably. So essentially it's a crash course. It's a general overview of the whole process, and then later over the coming weeks, coming months, we'll do some more webinars specifically aimed at those particular components of the design process. Also with this webinar, the aim is to essentially give homeowners a bit of a checklist or a workflow diagram so that they can understand it a little bit better. We go through a couple of different parts of this journey that homeowners go on. So obviously the design process, costing, I'll elaborate a little bit on that and the difficulties that we have in terms of giving a traditional square meterage. Priorities, how to set them, how to determine which ones are more valuable for you now, working with your designer as part of the design process, changes during design development that can cause time increases, and why we use a holistic approach to design. So a little bit of a background on Soho. We are predominantly an ESD firm with a design studio incorporated into it, so we pretty much are a one-stop shop for a lot of things. So through this particular webinar and journeying through all our other webinars, hopefully we'll facilitate that journey in the industry and for homeowners to get from A to Z, essentially. Part of our vision is about transitioning Australia to a sustainable built environment. So it's about education and advocacy and hand-holding and being a resource for information and doing little snippets of consulting that really get people where they want to go. Or we can do a whole design process from A to Z, essentially, that can get you the climate-ready house, or the house that we want to mean that it's reducing the demand on electricity and so forth. So in terms of the design process, typically it's been thought as this linear process. At Soho we do know that it's a little bit different than that, because it's more like this cyclical journey that we go on, where we are very heavy on in terms of the concept stage, so that we have a much clearer idea of the specification that is needed to build to the certain star rating, say. The way that I'd rather think about it is about this cup. So is a broad context at the top of the cup, and then it narrows down the more decisions we make and the more priorities we set and implement or schedule to really create this valuable, information-rich set of drawings that will get you this climate-ready home. So even before choosing where to live, so before thinking about what site you're actually going to look at, we need to start discussions with you. So we quite often get clients that will come in for a little bit of a quick crit session. They'll have a couple of sites that we can look at, so they haven't actually purchased anything yet, and that's a really valuable way for us to educate them on what to look for on the site. Say that it's got enough north, or we might notice that there's a big tree somewhere that might actually interfere with the way that solar panels might be placed, or something like that. So in terms of context in this funnel that we're creating, this larger cup, so the broad context of things, we're looking at the site. We're looking at where north is overshadowing from neighbours. So if there is a situation where maybe there's a two-storey building next door, or overlooking is a big one if there's apartments and balconies. Flooding issues, which are particularly related to areas like Mitcham or Waterfall Gully, Torrens Park. They've all got certain flooding requirements that need to be considered. Other council encumbrances, there's a certain volume that we can create a building in according to that. So part of the journey is justifying any decisions that are either slightly out of those council encumbrances but actually contribute to the site as a whole, or the journey for the occupant. or we're working out, is that site allowance a bit too big? We need to be more focused on size-wise design and creating a smaller footprint so we can get the performance out of the building or something like that. We can look at infrastructure, so are there bike paths nearby, public transport? Is it a really good opportunity to include an electric vehicle charger in the planning of the design so that we can actually facilitate that readiness for the future, essentially. So a lot of what we do at the front end is essentially feasibility. Part of that is working out if there are a couple of scenarios that we could use in that site, what is the best recommended scenario for the performance that the clients are wanting. Is the site, in terms of placement of buildings, too dense, or could it be more dense, and then that improve the performance? And also if there's any precedent along the street for a certain type of building. So in buildings, we talk about these typologies. There might be apartments, there might be just a single detached dwelling and so forth. And it's about finding that happy balance or that mix between those. So gradually we're filling up this funnel as we go. In terms of sustainable thinking, before choosing where to live and looking at the context of the site, we also look for essentially where we might potentially place things like solar array, because that might indicate what type of roof pitch we want to increase the performance of the PV. Are there any mains connections? Are you prepared to go off-grid? So for regional clients, quite often a question is, can they go off-grid? Which is certainly a yes, just requires a little bit more planning. But it's about making these decisions up front. So what we're actually doing when we're creating this funnel is essentially creating your brief. It's a clear set of expectations that a client has in terms of what they need and what they want. How much is usable land? So if there are easements across the site, we might plan a building around that to not interfere with the easement, which is essentially kind of council property. You don't build on it, but what we could do is start looking at how stormwater is integrated around those areas and how to holistically approach the site in terms of design to get the best possible outcome. In terms of demand reduction, my objective, and I guess the objective of anyone at Soho, is not to slap band-aid remedies like solar panels and so forth on a house to account for a poor performing building. Really what we want is to reduce the demand on electricity and other resources. So to do this, essentially what we do is we highly insulate the envelope of the building, so the walls, also the windows, because that is part of the insulation. If we discuss with you early on about air leakage, then we set those priorities in terms of how airtight the building is. So commonly you'll get leaking through certain parts of windows if they're not sealed correctly. Doors are a big one, garage doors, ceiling vents and so forth. So it's about having those strategies in place and making sure that your brief is very, very clear from the word go. By doing this, we're actually reducing the need to turn on heating and cooling. Therefore, it's reducing the demand and potentially getting us to a point where we don't need the heating and cooling add-ons within the house, except for maybe ceiling fans to get airflow, without having to then account for the cost that adding heating and cooling can create. So say you had a poorly performing building and your energy bill was $1,500 per quarter or something. So don't laugh, I've been there. So we get to that scenario. So it's a poorly insulated building. We've got a really high energy use per quarter. What we do is we try to slap on solar panels to drop that cost. What we should actually be doing is putting that money back into the envelope of the building and ensuring that from the outset the building is very highly insulated. So the importance of this is also that solar panels, batteries and so forth have a certain lifespan on their productivity or their efficiency. If we're insulating the envelope is going to last longer, the lifespan of the building is going to last longer, your costs and your capital investment are going to be paid off quicker, and last longer. So you're not having to replace things, and you're getting a much, much better performance out of your building than what you would otherwise have. We're really, really focusing on getting that passive performance and the natural performance of the building and materials, which naturally heat and cool. So we're looking at things like the density of the materials, exposed concrete slab potentially, or strategically placing dense materials, heavy materials like bricks in certain areas that get winter sun and then are shaded in summer, so that it can naturally use the performance of the building or the design and the programming inside of that to really enhance those spaces. And with that comes a whole lot of beauty in terms of design and aesthetics, and it's a really rewarding thing as a designer to have that balance right at the end of the project, and the result is such a beautiful building that performs well. Ensuring fresh air also helps. So if we go for a really airtight home, then we also might look at introducing fresh air into the building through a HRV system, which also heat recovery ventilation recovers the heat so that we're not losing the performance inside of the building too. There's quite a big decision to be made in terms of your sustainability objectives from the word go. So a lot of people think that adding technology to a house is just purely making it sustainable. It's not. It's about the makeup of the house and the construction methodology. It's also you determining how far you want to go, or do you want to stage it as well. So are you wanting to be energy neutral? There's all of these little categories around that we can aim for, but it's about you being informed about personally what hits you in the heart. What do you want to get out of this in the future? In terms of the categories that we can use, you hear terms out there, carbon neutral, carbon negative, carbon positive. There's different strategies that we can create around our design process before we get into development, so that we're not doing things twice and then expanding that design process or the timeline out even further. If a building is carbon positive, there was a building that I believe was in Melbourne, a little transportable that was essentially carbon positive. It created more energy than it used and then could feed it back into the grid as well. And then this is where we get with these new types of houses, where we could actually couple them together and create little microgrids and systems whereby those owners become empowered to be the suppliers. So it's a very exciting time in the industry. In terms of the designer, where we fit in, we are designers. We're also obviously able to test out the performance and do a really integrated design process. We're very lucky where we are. And so where Soho fits in terms of the broad scheme of things, or with other builders and so forth, we can come in at the front end of the design process. We can do this consulting and the return brief, just to make sure that you've got enough information there to go out and effectively communicate to your builder or architect what it is that you're needing in terms of performance, how far you want to go. We can also work in the concept stage, providing sketches and developing that concept into construction documentation, which is another thing. We can go right into detailing down to how it's going to be constructed on site, and manage that process on site as well, or do the full design process. So there's a number of different ways that we can be involved in your project to just make sure that you're getting that quality of sustainable development and performance that you're after. So again, with this funnel, what we're looking at is filling it with this information to really effectively communicate and give you the confidence to actually take that next step forward and work out whether you want to be involved in the design process. Are there parts of the specification that you want to do? Are you a researcher? Do you want to go research certain materials to really emphasise and push where you could get to in terms of sustainable design on the building. So in terms of site evaluation, when we're filling this cup, what we can look at is essentially a site with you. So once you have purchased land, essentially you would look at a site and work out what the setbacks are for the council, what is the usable space that we can create. From there we start creating volumes and working out essentially what is the glazing to wall ratio, and is it nice and balanced so that you get a really good performance. One really easy way of doing this is actually creating this volume and looking at it in Hubble, which is a tool that we have access to, and basically that predicts what sort of star rating we could get for that volume. Within that, we are also looking at types of glazing, roof colour and so forth. We can start looking at things like, is brick better? So do we need the thermal mass inside of places? Is the floor needing to be insulated if it's up in the Adelaide Hills? Is it airtight construction and so forth? So we can set all of these little steps in place for the workflow that really gives us a solid foundation to work from in the future. So you can see if we have a site like this, which is the outside area, say that's your site, and we have a certain area that we're only allowed to build in for the council, then we can start extruding up this volume essentially. It can be cut into, we wouldn't necessarily use the whole space because quite often it's too big. And then we start looking at things like, in this case, does it have a boundary wall? Well, we know that can only be 3 metres high. That's our basis on the south, which is not a bad thing, it's the south. On the north, we might want to increase the opportunity to get high level lighting, so we might increase this shape so that we have opportunity for high level windows, or we can really work on that north glazing. When we start cutting into that space, especially in this example, then we might look at daylighting as well. So the diagram on the right is actually an example of daylighting. It was done as part of the BDAV, or Design Matters 10-Star Challenge, and this used to be what our 10-star home looked like. There were some other reiterations of it as well, but being on the south, we wanted to make sure in this instance that bedroom 2 had enough lighting. So if this was on the boundary, we would have to have a courtyard, so we can kind of look at the building and the performance and how much light we can get into those spaces, and then work out, is that enough? Is it visually enough? Is it okay for mental health and comfort inside of that space to have a tiny little window? Well, we might actually emphasise the height of it and give more connection to the outside and make the experience inside of the house a little bit better, which also ties into the performance. So in terms of the next stage of the process, once we've got that really solid return brief essentially that we can give you with a bit of a checklist, we go into concept design, and we might sketch from this volume what our proposal is. So we're not only targeting energy performance, because that is what our ultimate goal is on a sustainable house, working out whether you do want to go for an airtight design, how often you're going to be opening your doors and windows yourself. Do you have do you prefer your house to be open all the time with the windows, and other things that can tie into air tightness is acoustics. Some people in suburban areas prefer to have a really insulated envelope because it helps with acoustics. They can't hear all the noise outside, so that's another consideration that we can have. Size-wise design means that we're not designing too big. We really interrogate those spaces with you and make sure that they are going to be used to their maximum performance, but also we don't have wasted space. We don't like designing with wasted space, or if there's an opportunity to combine technical areas that are unconditioned or something like that, then we'll generally discuss that with you if it's going to mean that the performance of your building is better. Future use and lifespan is an interesting one through the concept design process, because we have to think about it, but we're not yet into design development. But what we can do is set some expectations as a designer about what you see the lifespan of this building being. Are you going to end up having a multi-generational family living in the house or something like that? So it's about having that dialogue about how the building is going to adapt in the future. And it's a really important part of the design process and the concept design, because the next stage that we get into is essentially planning. Once we're in planning, we really need to get the envelope of the building sorted and have no changes, so that we don't have to go through minor amendments with council. Budget in terms of house, land and energy is a good discussion to have early on. A lot of people come to us and they say, okay, well, our construction budget is this, but then as soon as you start taking out certain aspects that they want, like they want to pull, well, you know, that's automatically potentially 50 to 100k out of their construction budget. So you need to be realistic about whether your construction budget is just for your house or if it's for around the house as well, including fencing and stuff like that. Things like fencing and landscaping we can also put in our designs as it's going through the planning process, because it's a clear communication to the council about the overall intent and how the building performs back down to that neighbour and beyond. Does it overlook into anyone's backyard or into habitable rooms and so forth? And we really want you to be involved in this journey as well, because if you sit back and don't participate, then it makes it really hard to know what your expectations are, and we're gonna quiz you and push you to really use your words and describe what it is that you really want to feel when you step into that space. In terms of the National Construction Code, in deciding where to go in terms of efficiency, the little video that's playing down here is a little example of, it's actually a 10-star house video that I did, and then I started down-specking it. But we get in there early with a prelim assessment using this software, and it really gets us to understand what the heating and cooling requirements are going to be. So here's the little blurb from that actual software, but it's predicted energy, annual energy loading for heat and cooling based on standard occupancy assumptions. So by occupancy assumptions, what we're looking at when we're designing is, if I take it a little bit further and pause it there. So in terms of occupancy, we're looking at spaces that have use at a certain time of day. For instance, a living area is predominantly used during the daytime, so this is the green area in this instance. Bedrooms might only be used at night time. Ensuite, probably definitely night time, or at least during times of the day when it's not considered a peak. If we had a garage, that might be unconditioned and appear grey on our diagram as well. So it's a good way of us working out what types of use you're going to have in those spaces, how often it's going to be used, and just predicting the star rating that little bit further down to the detail. And I'll show you a detail diagram in just a second of the wall makeup and so forth. What this step does give us is a very good basis to go into estimation with a very clear-cut set of expectations on how many ceiling fans are going to be in there. Are there downlights? The window or door openability, so how the window or the glazing is separated into parts that open and parts that are fixed. How much insulation does that glazing essentially supply? So in terms of having a really insulated envelope, if we're really insulating the solid parts of the wall and then putting in single glazing, it's going to completely undo what we're doing. So we try to find a happy balance between those so that we're not having to put more materials into the building than what we're having to. Materials and performance, we can also test out things like concrete slab on ground, if it's exposed or if it has tiles, how to get the best performance out of that as well, which is really important. If we're looking at acoustics, then we might automatically put carpet or something like that in a bedroom, just to make it that little bit more quiet, but then if it doesn't work in the performance, we might find a different solution as well. So it's really important to go through the step and go through it early before you get to your builder with the design that you're proposing, and have a really clear idea for them on what they are quoting on. It's the only way that you're really going to compare apples with apples as well. Okay, so in terms of demand reduction, again, going back to this particular slide that I had before, we're really wanting to specify down within that concept design what parts of this house are going to be performing in certain ways. And the reason we do this is because we have this benchmark in the industry with the star ratings from NatHers. And this is a little graph. There are a lot of numbers here, but I'm about to go into it a little bit closer, a little bit clearer. But what it does show is that there's different star ratings that are required. Now, the minimum star rating technically under the National Construction Code is 6 stars. However, there are performance solutions out there that mean that your house might go through lower than that unless you actually explicitly specify that you want a certain performance. So say in the instance that you went to a builder and you got their design and you're happy with it and so forth, unless you're actually specifying that you're wanting at least that benchmark of 6 stars, then you might get a building that goes through at a lower star rating. Now, the implications of that, if we are considering that the 6-star house is that bare minimum for the National Construction Code, you can see that if your house went through at, say, 3.5 stars, it's actually performing twice as bad as the 6-star house, and the 6-star is the minimum. What we've got down the bottom here as well, actually I'll go back to the other one. So what we've got down the bottom is exactly that, it's explaining that. So it's taking the predicted heating and cooling loads according to the certificate and showing against the 6 stars how many 10-star houses essentially could be built against that 6-star benchmark, or how many 5.5 stars we could build for that 6-star energy consumption. And it's interesting when you get to this slide because it really shows as you get up above that minimum standard, how many buildings you could essentially build for the equivalent performance of that 6-star house. So if the annual heating and cooling of the 6-star house is, say, 96, whereas a 10-star house is 3, if you do the maths, then effectively you could, for the same performance of a 6-star house, build 32 10-star houses to create the same energy. The target that we prefer is around about 8. It depends on the location and the other inputs in the building in terms of technology and so forth, and what your brief is. So we generally hover, depending on what the client is actually asking for, between 7 and 10. Average is probably about 8. And we've currently got an 8.2 star house up next to our 10-star house up at Woodford, which is on the market, and so we should have some more data that actually clarifies, yes, in fact, if we were building an 8-star house, it's going to perform 2 times better than a 6-star house. So it's really important to have this dialogue with your builder. So in terms of setting priorities, this is a huge one for us because we want to explicitly understand what your expectations are. And so some of the questions that we ask you when you come in are things like, what are your primary goals? What are you setting out to do? How long do you have to do this? Do you want to do part now and then part later? How is it going to be sustainable or low energy? And these are some of the responses that we actually get back from clients, and I'll show a couple more slides with other indications of what people are asking for, which might give you hopefully a bit more of an idea of where to sit your priorities. We are certainly not going to tell you what your priorities are, but it's about having a conversation and having this clear and open communication, and us kind of hand-holding you through the process if you need it, so that we can set these expectations with you. So some people want a large family home, someone off-grid might have a better idea of having a small home because they're not actually going to be in it much during the day, they're going to be out on a farm or so forth. So it's about having this communication. In terms of what clients tell us that they need, 62.5% of our clients rate energy efficiency as the highest priority. Now, I will admit this might be somewhat skewed because people come to us because we build energy efficient houses, but still that is showing that is their high priority. And then we can have a discussion with them about what they envisage is a sustainable home. What essentially they envisage is energy efficiency. 50% of our clients rate water efficiency as a priority, which is fantastic, potentially because of droughts and so forth. But if we're oversizing rainwater tanks or looking at the collection potential of a roof, that's a really good strategy to have before you go into design development, so we can work out how big this house is going to be, where the roof flows, and what sort of water is going to be captured essentially. 75% of our clients rate natural light as a top priority, so that's a really great one for us to work with, because then we can always work with opening up to the north and really creating that passive performance in the building, where during the winter we're getting as much light in as possible, and then summer we're occluding it with shading or the eaves overhang or something like that. And it's a really great way for us to work naturally with the passive performance of the house, and also enhancing that demand reduction on electricity. I will also say that the majority of our homes that we design don't generally have a gas connection, because we're after that renewable source with the electricity and tying into solar and so forth. It's not impossible, but it's just our preference, but we can have that discussion with you as well. So in terms of the needs that people have, you can see that it's quite of a mixed bag in terms of the stats that we have from what clients need. These are the different areas that we ask them whether they need or not, or they might give us an idea of some other areas that they like. But essentially, over 50% of people are asking for a master with an ensuite, or 2 to 3 bedrooms, depending on how big their house is going to be, the lounge and the living. We do occasionally have people that want a rumpus room as well, but they do understand generally that the performance of the building will work better if we're clustering certain types of space use together. Kitchen, private bathroom and garage. Now it's interesting that garage pops up at the early stages of design, because quite often we find that when we're going through the performance of the building, we're showing them the implications in that First Rate 5 software of with a garage, with no garage. They actually quite often will choose a carport instead, because the garage, being an unconditioned area, really sucks the performance out of a building. We can thermally isolate parts like that of the house, but it still does drop the performance of the house down a little bit. Now though, there is the requirement to have the garage door sealed. So again, that's another question that you can ask your builder, make sure that it's sealed, because that'll also help stop having that cold air coming into your house. In terms of the development application, and why I've put it here in the webinar, is that it's really important to have a lot of these decisions done early. That's why in terms of building a sustainable house, a concept design phase with us is probably a little bit heavier than other places. That's what makes us unique. We make those decisions with you, and then that way, going through development application and then into documentation, we're not having to do different iterations of the same design with little changes in planning, which means that it can take a little bit longer in terms of submitting to planning, waiting 6 weeks or so forth. Every time there's a change, not only do our plans have to change, but it needs to be reanalysed in the council, reanalysed in the performance software. So it's a really good idea to have the envelope of the building and the windows, especially by town planning, set in concrete. And then as we go into documentation, we can also slightly tweak the interiors of the house, but not too much, just so that we're still maintaining that performance. And the reason why after development application we sometimes have the need for engineering and so forth is that sometimes the internal spacing between certain areas need to be structurally represented in certain ways, and we can actually work with that part of the design before it goes through the final development application process, the building rules consent with the council. Earlier on in this process at town planning, generally we're finding some of these other services that we used to engage later are now being brought further into the or earlier in the design process by the councils. So part of that is the civil engineering. They're wanting to really understand how stormwater is going to be delivered on site. Site survey, obviously, so that we can get the proper proportions with the neighbours. If you're asking for a survey, generally go a couple of metres beyond the boundaries so that we can make sure that we're not going to overshadow certain windows that are habitable on your neighbours. Soil tests. On tricky submissions, private planners are really useful because not only can they work with us, and there's a huge amount of dialogue that goes back and forth, but it really gives you the best possible potential to get through planning on the word go. So they are very useful, but it is an additional service. Prelim structural and hydraulic engineering is not a bad idea to get a really good idea of that straight after town planning, because then we can space certain parts of the building in certain ways, or we can really target at that stage where we might have the nervous system of the building coming. So especially in the case of the 8.2 star house and the 10 star house, we have this central nervous system, which is essentially a surface riser that goes inside of the house. A single penetration through the slab so that we have complete air tightness as much as possible. And if we're putting that into planning and the structure, we really need to massage that plan to make everything work. So it's a really good idea to have that involvement early. And then obviously we can look at prelim estimation with builders. Design development really hones down into those other categories within design and aesthetics that we can also look at in terms of sustainability. And this is probably where a lot of our clients find that they can feel involved, which is very important to me. Part of Soho and our vision statement to drive that transition is about having people included in that conversation, and that includes clients. So if the client wants to go research a certain type of material or certain finish, we might give them a bit of guidance, and then they can input into that design process what their specification is also. And then that way they can also liaise with the builder on cost based on that specification. Heating and cooling types. So some people, in terms of comfort, even if we're designing a house that doesn't need heating or cooling and stays somewhere between 18 and 22 degrees, some people like it warmer or cooler. Some people just like airflow. Generally, I always specify ceiling fans in a space just to make sure the air is moving, at least inside of a building. But it's about having that conversation early on about where they're going to be, and then we can almost hide them within the aesthetics and integrate them into this nervous system. Lighting is an interesting one, because if we're doing the daylighting study, like I showed in the concept design phase, what we might do is focus artificial lighting in spaces that are going to be dark instead of those light spaces, so we get a really nice uniform lighting level through the building. That also potentially leaves us with an opportunity that we can essentially reduce the amount of artificial lighting that we need in the house, again dropping down the energy demand on the house. Energy storage is a big one. That definitely needs to be integrated into the design process and design development to ensure that we're putting it in the right place. Does it need additional cover around it, or do you want to see it from the outside? Automation and display is also another big one, because you can imagine this nervous system coming through the house, and you know, there's parts that you do and don't want to see. The idea is to have it as discreet as possible, but in terms of having home automation on the house and making the energy storage of the batteries, or the, you know, what's happening with the solar panels, and powering down the house, making that all visible to someone that's actually in the house on their handheld device is quite important. So we need that networking into that nervous system. The other thing that we are learning more and more about is strategic programming to reduce the construction costs. That also is also tied into potentially where we're using thermal mass. We have learnt through different projects that analysing the house based on a standard construction and adding the thermal mass on the inside strategically just in certain points rather through the whole building is a really good way of keeping down construction costs, and the studs can run straight to the outside of the buildings. Where to find info? So up at the 10-star house, which is about to open for data monitoring, and then September 2nd will be open to the public. Come up and have conversations with us, book in for appointments, and we can go through these elements with you and really get you really on a good trajectory to get what it is that you want out of the home. So we're going to start scheduling appointments for that from September the 2nd. So I think on the 3rd and the 4th we've already got some bookings. So contact us early on and take advantage of what's going on in the industry at the moment, especially with the grant that's out there. The other thing that you can do if you're wanting more information on particular things, follow us on YouTube, because there's not only industry webinars that happen frequently from us, but there's also some virtual reality tours of the 8-star house, 10-star house. There's going to be a virtual reality tour very soon. We're also going to be doing a webinar series on the partners and the products in the house, so that you have that information as well. Homeowner guides in terms of what is the concept design, what is design development. We can give you some examples of what to expect in terms of level of development of the drawings and so forth, and we can also do guided tours through the house. So get in touch, follow us on YouTube, and that is a great resource for you in terms of what other terms you might have to research. So in terms of the ultimate question that people ask us and why it is a little bit different, this essentially involves us liaising with a builder. So early on in our design process, we do prefer to work with the builders while this concept phase is going on. The reason being is that builders have different construction methodologies, different relationships with their suppliers, and different discounts that they can get from certain suppliers. So it's very important in terms of achieving a much better result at the end to liaise with them very, very early. And we can also work with their preferred construction methodology and then optimize it to the performance that you're wanting. The advantage of that also is that you're not going to the final stages of essentially documentation and then finding out that your performance of the building is maybe getting 5 stars, and then you're actually wanting an 8-star house. It's much better to get that idea early on, discussing it with the builder, finding out what type of insulation. If it's going to be a super insulated building, then we might do a WUFI assessment to work out what the implications are of sweating of certain materials, or is there condensation building up and certain things like that. We might use first rate 5 to particularly target areas that need more heating and cooling, so that we have a much more uniform performance of the building overall. So it's about having that dialogue. In terms of the square metering rate, it is a bit of an old method, and there are some challenges in doing it. So the 2 scenarios I'm going to give you hopefully will explain that a little bit, but essentially in scenario 1, if we have someone that comes in and wants a small off-grid house that's about 120 square metres, might have 2 beds, bath, mudroom. If it's off-grid, it might be in the hills or something where they're got orchards or something and washing fruit. They might definitely want water collection, more than likely will want a lot of it. Not connected to the grids or main, definitely would have PV array and rainwater retention as well, maybe rain gardens. So there's a whole lot of little intricacies that go into the planning of that are vastly different than scenario 2. In particular, especially with the rainwater collection, there might be additional plumbing systems or pumps that are required. If it's a mudroom, they might want extra sinks and so forth. So it's very hard to compare apples with apples in terms of square meterage rate on buildings. You're much better off having a concept, taking it to different builders and getting the price that way, as long as you've got a specification, and a clear specification from us. Scenario 2, if you had a large family, 210 square metres, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. It might have a rumpus. Just has the general general water collection from the roof. It is connected to mains and grid. It could give you a couple more scenarios, because it could be a family home that is just typically sort of insulated to maybe 6-7 stars, works fairly well, but then the occupants want to be able to switch on a split system. Or it could be a house that, in terms of connecting to mains and the grid, it could be a high performing house, 9 stars, and therefore it's going to hopefully produce more energy than it uses, and then the person wants to feed that back into the grid, and then have some sort of offset there. Or it could be a cluster of these houses together, they're actually working together. With that scenario, there might be a whole lot of electrical components that are vastly different to the other scenario. So that's why when you're comparing square meterage rate from one builder to another, and designers generally won't give you a square meterage rate, where we understand that it's not a way to compare apples with apples. It's hard to have that explicitly address all of your needs within your brief. Hopefully that's the best way that I can describe it. In terms of estimation, how much information you might need, so you definitely need the rough thermal specification and strategy. This not only includes like insulation in walls and roof and whether the slab's insulated, it'll also address windows, how well performing they are, whether they have blinds on the outside, because that is sometimes a good strategy if we don't want to go and up-spec a window even more. Sometimes it works really well just to have an external blind. But we really need to get all of that sorted before we go through council, so that we can get the pre-approval from council that this is going to work for their guidelines. This is the in detail sort of scenario that I was talking about in terms of planning the house. So I mean, this could change slightly depending on what products you're using, but we get a very good idea of the different layers within the side of a building and how well that's performing. These are different scenarios, but essentially it can show all the air layers in a wall and how it's going to perform. Do we want a ventilated cavity or a still cavity? Do we need certain sorts of membranes within that? So first rate 5, which is where this snippet comes from, is very good because we can really analyse that from the word go. Different types of insulation as well. I mentioned rock wool versus a healthy earth wall. They can perform a little bit differently in the software, same as polystyrenes and so forth. So it's a really good idea to have a very rough specification of what it is that you're wanting to get out of these materials in the design. Ideas of finishes. So in terms of going into just a general estimation, they might give you a provisional sum for a certain amount of finishes. If you choose above that, then you've got to pay more. You really got to visually demonstrate to them what your expectations are on those finishes. So this particular example is of a high level finish in terms of sustainability. It's got low VOC products in it. The plasterboards are carbon neutral. Low VOC paints as well, so there's, or there might even be no VOC in this particular example. But it really enhances the indoor air quality of the space, and low embodied energy of products are a very typical analysis that you might do at this stage. Or do you want timber inside, and is that a carbon sink? So it's a good idea to have some visuals. You could use Pinterest or something like that to save a couple of visuals of what sort of level of detail you're wanting. Otherwise you might get into a situation where you're expecting a beautiful kitchen with high level cupboards or overhead cupboards over top, and then all you're given is just the base cupboards down the bottom with nothing over top. You might just get a standard laminate bench top and so forth. So it's a really good idea to have a very clear way of communicating to people what it is that you're actually expecting. This is actually the World Green Building Council's guidelines, but it's where we're heading as well. So Australia's about 10 years behind the UK. In the UK, they're now asking for certain high performance specifications on every building. We are not quite there yet, but if we are building especially below 6 stars at the moment, then we're certainly not going to get there in a hurry. We're certainly not going to bridge that gap that we currently have. We need to build better and smarter, which doesn't necessarily mean that it has to cost more. We've just got to make sure that we've got the explicit amounts or the explicit instructions in terms of the specification and the insulation and so forth clearer to our builders so they know what they're getting. The more we're specifying of these high performance materials, the lower cost they end up becoming and so forth. A bit tricky at the moment because of the transport in between states and internationally, but we're getting there. In terms of holistic approach, this is what we do in terms of an integrated design studio and ESD consultancy. So we look at the whole big picture. We're trying to really empower our contacts that come to us to have enough information to make an informed decision. So it's about educating and advocating for them. We advocate for them throughout the design process and into construction as well. So monitor if it's going to be a super insulated building, super airtight building, and the builder hasn't done that before, we can be there to actually handhold them through that and explain details and be on site and check that they're installed correctly as well. So it's about having that level of control over the building to achieve your end result. Be informed and be strategic. So use the checklist that we're going to provide. At the end of this, I'll give you an email to email and we'll provide that to you. So be explicit about what your expectations are in terms of energy and performance. So again, with that chart in terms of where you sit in terms of a 6-star house, 8-star, 10-star or below, be very explicit about what your expectations are. Very commonly we get calls from people that we've never ever worked with before. They've got a hands on their energy certificate and they've found out that certain insulation hasn't been put inside of the building. I believe my brother's house was a good example of that. He found the insulation still in the bags in the ceiling. So it's about making sure that you're getting what you're paying for, but getting what you are clearly, explicitly asking for. Don't focus on solar as demand reduction. It's not. It's band-aiding over the top. Solar is super important for housing, but the first thing that you should be looking at is this highly insulated envelope, the better performing passive building. It's the only way that we're going to drive down emissions on houses. Demand reduction means for the life of the building. So again, tying into that solar concept, things like that do have a lifespan on them. So you might have to replace your solar panels in terms of 20 years or so. If you're highly insulating the building and doing it right from the word go and got this passive approach, then your building remains that high performance for the long term. So you're getting your return in your capital investment. Get transparency from your builder. So get a copy of your energy certificate and make sure that all of those items are a part of that. This includes specification of certain materials that you might have wanted in there that are sustainable, but it's about having that open dialogue. One of the most important parts in terms of sustainable housing and where we're going is about air tightness. So I've actually just nicked this from a colleague's webinar, but essentially in terms of Adelaide's first 10-star home and the air tightness, so air tightness is represented in a couple of numbers here. This gives you what the CSIRO did an Australia-wide study on, and a lot of houses came back at 15 air changes. In the UK, it's very low. Passive house is one of the most stringent specifications in the world. Generally, you've got to meet 0.6. The 10-star home has done that, which is possibly one of the first 10-star homes in Australia to do that. So we'll see. But there's certain criteria that in terms of air tightness on building that is really important to have in your understanding as well. You can also check on YouTube. There is this video from Jess explaining in a nutshell what air tightness is. It's a very good way for you to understand the benefits of it without me going into it. So again, follow our YouTube channel and check that video out. The other thing that you can do for any Adelaidean there is Soho is one of the founding partners of Carbon Neutral Adelaide. On their website they have a few links to different grants that are available for energy and so forth, but they have a few dot points of where you can start also, so that's another good reference. In terms of future questions with us, so you can email the studio. We'll send through the checklist in terms of what sort of things you might want to ask your builder, but also chat to us about how to get involved in terms of the design process and making sure that you're getting what you're wanting. Return briefs, as I said, are very good. We can do that for you. You can visit the 10-star house once that opens, so book in for a tour. YouTube, Soho Australia, we've got our website. We're sometimes sharing things that we find out there in industry that are really interesting as well, so you can have a look on our social media. And coming soon we'll have, again with this, a bit of a series on the design process and empowering owners to actually make those decisions and make that step, because for some it's a little bit scary, but it doesn't need to be. So thank you for watching. I'll double check whether there are any questions just now. There is a little bit of a lag with the questions. Doesn't look like there's any questions on there. No, there's no questions on there. So thank you for watching, but get in touch and hopefully we can be of assistance. And we're really, as I said, wanting to fulfill that Soho's vision, which is to essentially facilitate the change in the industry to transition Australia to a more sustainable built environment, and this is one of the ways that we can do that. So thank you very much for watching.